Question mark or week? Question mark. Let's be loud. Yell it out. I'm hearing year is the loudest, but how about we just say in honor of dolphin awareness, we are having a bingo and movie night. We're going to show the movie Dolphin Tale. If you've never seen it, it's cute. So Dolphin Tale is going to be playing in the Wallace Room. Big bingo game in Fleck that starts at 7 on Friday. It is $5 to enter and play all night. And that money is going to go to a very good cause supporting the Dolphins. Okay, Saturday and Sunday, time-wise, I'm still like working it out, but it's like tournament season. We love it. And we're answering the call for more games. So there's gonna be another 3 versus 3 basketball tournament. And we're gonna have a Twister tournament, and we'll try to get a trip off campus too. So be on the lookout for the Student Life email. We'll detail all of that and send out a Google form today too. Okay, next.
All right, the next part of Assembly, we have several presentations that we intended to do as a part of Black History Month that we simply ran out of time for. So we're bringing those back today, so I'll turn things over to them.
Okay, so hi everybody. Even though it's not Black History Month, we are still celebrating important Black historical figures in our life. So today, I'm Rebecca, and me and Liv are going to be talking about Felipe Alou. Alou, we read about Alou in Spanish too, which we both took last year, and the important historical events surrounding his life.
Felipe Alou was born in 1935 in the Dominican Republic. Alou grew up in a mixed racial family where his mother was white and his father was black. The idea of segregation was abnormal to him because of growing up in a mixed family. His career started when he was introduced to track and started by playing the javelin. Alou played both the javelin and baseball for most of his high school career, but ended up focusing solely on baseball. Alou's dream was different than the goals that his father wanted him to achieve, which posed a problem for him. His father wanted him to be a doctor, but Alou wanted to continue his dream of being a baseball player, and so he did. Alou's dream paid off because he won a gold medal at the Pan American Games when he was in 12th grade.
Okay, so before any great can get to the top, like Alou did, there's always obstacles to get in the way. So Alou had a huge language barrier and could not speak much English, spoke Spanish for most of his time, so it made it difficult to understand many of his teammates, managers, and just people in general. He couldn't enter the same facilities as the white players. One time during a game, he couldn't even enter in the players' entrance and had to enter with the fans. He was forced to sit in the back of a bus on a long 2-day road trip, and during that road trip, he couldn't eat for those 2 days because a restaurant had a blacks-only line, and every time he would get to the front of the line, the bus was about to leave, so he didn't get to eat his first hamburger until 2 days afterwards. He also was required to live in secret in the home of a white family in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And lastly, once him and his teammate Orlando, one of the only other black players on the team, they went to get a fancy suit and sit at a restaurant, and the restaurant would not let them in.
Even though Alou had many hard days where he had to battle racism, segregation, and a language barrier, he still overcame and led a very monumental life. On this slide, there are a few of his accomplishments, but he also had many more. Alou started by playing the javelin when he was in 11th grade and made it to the national track team of the Dominican Republic. In 1955, Alou competed at the Pan American Games and won a gold medal for baseball. Later that year, he would sign his first contract with the New York Giants for $200. Throughout his career, he played for many other teams and ended up making it to the major leagues. When he retired, he managed the Montreal Expos and the San Francisco Giants. He even won a couple awards for Manager of the Year. So even though Alou had many obstacles throughout his life, he ended up leading a very successful one.
Okay, so lastly, this quote from Alou in English means, "I have confidence in my abilities and my intelligence. I wasn't bitter in the past, and I'm not bitter now. I've had a good life."
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ima, and I'll be presenting on Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde famously introduced herself the same way. I'm a Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, doing my work, coming to ask you if you're doing yours. Lorde was purposeful in her introduction. In identifying everything that she was became a way to demystify the assumption that these terms could not inhabit the same space. Her struggles with racism, classism, sexism, and homophobia were not separate from each other. Thus, her identities were not separate from each other. Audre started her writing career at a young age, having had her first work published in a 17 magazine when she was just in high school. Her works would touch on political issues surrounding identity, including African heritage, Blackness, femininity, sexuality, class, gender, and motherhood. She examined these through both a local and global perspective, all while documenting her journey of self-discovery. She also published essays and journals detailing her struggle with breast cancer, in hopes of fostering a connection with other women of color facing the same issues. In her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, Lorde describes poetry as a skeleton architecture of our lives. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. This quote speaks to Lorde's hope for her work, to be able to provoke thought that could lead to the changes that she wanted to make reality. Audre began her teaching career in 1972. As a Black career woman in white academia, she understood that she had been given a special platform. Her experiences would later go on to inform both her life and work. Throughout her years as an educator, Lorde contributed to feminist theory, critical race studies, and queer theory. As an activist, she was central to many liberation movements, including second wave feminism, the civil rights and other Black cultural movements, and struggles for the LGBTQ+ equality. Quite controversial in her time, Lorde was a critic of second wave feminism, noting the movement separated gender oppression from other oppressive systems such as racism, classism, and homophobia. Lorde pushed to see intersectionality embraced within the movement. She writes, Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. Lorde's writing introduced her to many activist circles which would go on to inspire her work, which she believed came from the intersection of her and her worlds. To speak the truth as I see it and to share not just my triumphs, not just the things that felt good, but the pain, the intense, often unmitigating pain. That is what Audre Lorde believed in, and that is her legacy. In her works, Lorde addressed her concerns to not only the United States, but also to the world. Her message spoke about encouraging a celebration of our differences, instead of using them as tools of isolation. In Sister Outsider, Audre writes, it is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. If you're interested in reading some of Lorde's work, here are a few options. Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, Sister Outsider, The Selective Works of Audre Lorde by Roxane Gay, The Cancer Journals, Your Silence Will Not Protect You, Poetry is Not a Luxury, and From a Land Where Other People Live. Audre Lorde, despite the challenges she faced, never allowed herself to be dismissed or labeled as an other. Her life and legacy inspires Black women like myself to do the same. So to wrap up, I leave you with one of my favorite Audre Lorde quotes. My silence had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I had made contact with others, while we examined the word to fit a world in which we all believed, bridging our differences. Thank you.
So the last person that we want to talk about in Black History Month is Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was a bisexual Black woman who was born in St. Louis, Missouri in the early 1900s. So she was breaking a lot of boundaries just with living her life at that time. She was an actor, she was a dancer, she was a singer, she was an entertainer, and she was a spy for the French Resistance. So she had an exciting life. Baker made her name in the United States as an entertainer, but given a lot of the things that were happening with segregation and the way that black entertainers were being treated in the United States, she ended up going over to France to do a European tour and was so welcomed there and so included in French society that she ended up staying there. So she lived her life in France. She was incredibly influential on other artists. For example, Beyonce gave a performance that included dances that were originally done by Josephine Baker. So she's had a huge amount of influence. She was an expat in France, and she gathered a community of Black American creatives who had moved over there briefly. So people like James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, that sort of group there, and she kind of encouraged their development of their creativity. So she was recently honored by the French government by being put in the Pantheon. So her remains were interred in the Pantheon, which is a incredible cultural honor for the French. She is the first black woman to be interred into the Pantheon. And we have a short video that it kind of explains why they brought her into the Pantheon and what that means for Black Americans and for Black people who are living in France.
A moment nearly 50 years in the making finally took place in the City of Lights today. Artist, activist, and spy Josephine Baker received one of the highest honors in France. ABC's Ibtissem Genfoot was in Paris for the event.
Tonight, a historic moment in Paris. 46 years after her death, Josephine Baker's voice echoes through the city, posthumously receiving one of France's highest honors. Being added to the Pantheon is reserved for France's national heroes, and Baker is the first person born in the U.S. to be interred there. Baker was a star of the silver screen in Europe, a dancer, and civil rights activist. But secretly, she was a spy for the French resistance during World War II, performing across Nazi-occupied Europe, hiding messages on her music sheets, and sharing them with the British.
She was generous, and she was a very idealist woman and person.
Born at the turn of the century, the young woman from St. Louis, Missouri, became an icon of the Roaring '20s. She was only 19 years old when her manager convinced her to make the journey across the Atlantic.
Picture it, the lights dimming, the crowds clapping in eagerness when a young Josephine Baker enters the stage for the first time. This was 96 years ago here in Paris in this very theater, and the show became legendary.
But for some, choosing Baker to be in the Pantheon raises concerns over representation of Black people in France.
It's true, she had an amazing life. She was really brave at some point. She was committed to a lot of really righteous causes, right? But at the same time, her name comes up whenever we want to have whenever we're having a conversation about racism in France. In the 1920s, the 1930s, she was embracing some colonial stereotypes, like the banana skirt, for instance, and it created some type of stereotypes that affected Black people in France.
Kevin Donat organizes Black Paris walks for tourists and locals. He says his tours on the Black history in the City of Lights have never been so popular.
Paris and France in general are very, very popular with tourists in general. So there were lots of people coming to Paris for the very first time, and they were surprised with diversity in Paris. Questions about why are there so many Black people here? Why are there so many people of color?
Paris was once a haven for Black American artists fleeing segregation. But some argue Baker's story and success should not gloss over the endemic racism. Amid calls to end discrimination in France, Black Lives Matter banners also turning up in French protests.
After the death of George Floyd and a lot of difficult conversations we're also having in France about police brutality, inequality, all of these questions.
Dona says a lot of people who take his tours are surprised to see so much Black influence in Paris. But France has a long colonial past, and its culture is rich with influences that stretch across Africa to the Caribbean islands.
Where are the other Black people buried there?
Yes, so there are. So I told you the oldest one is Alexandre Dumas. Because if it was up to me, there would be like 10 other Black people at least. But Paris is part of the Black world, is part of the Black Atlantic. There's been lots of connections for a very long time through colonialism with different parts of the world.
And it's not just Josephine Baker who's left an impression. Many Black American artists, from James Baldwin to Nina Simone, have made their mark on French culture.
Everybody want to come here to perform.
And why do you think that is?
Paris, for the culture, is very important. For the music, of course, but for the painters, for the writers, it's like New York, but after New York.
And for Black Americans who decided to make Paris home, like Tiffany Davis, an important part of their history.
Paris, in so many ways, is a part of African American history. It's been really cool to see how many African American creatives who came here, from Langston Hughes to James Baldwin, who sat at Café de Flore and wrote, wrote "Go Tell It on the Mountain," to, I know Nina Simone lived here for a little bit, Josephine Baker, and for me, it's just really cool to walk the streets of, so many African American creatives who came before me.
Today, Josephine Baker is the first Black woman to have a legacy inked in the Pantheon, dedicated to individuals who've made their mark on the history of France. She's seen as a hero of World War II.
It was a very great pleasure to know that my mother would enter in this historical place.
The French army now also making the original archives of Baker's war efforts available to the public. For Brian, Baker's adopted son, this is a precious gift.
When you watch a document and who are the real document, historical document, it's a strange feeling.
French President Emmanuel Macron even calls Baker the incarnation of the French spirit. And tonight, also remarking that Baker was a member of the LGBTQ community, something she has been celebrated for in recent years.
Aux côtés d'un homme, une nuit, au bras d'une femme, une autre, elle qui a deux amours.
A coffin carrying soil from the US, France, and Monaco, where Baker is buried, and all her medals brought to the French Pantheon, cementing her place in France's history. Ibtisam Genfood for ABC News in Paris, France.
Recognition of historic proportions there, our thanks to Ibtisam.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here.
Good morning. Thank you for your attention as we work our way through these important conversations in our community. My name is Katie Kersey, and I teach history here, and along with several other faculty members and a group of students, we've been working to create a very short program today about the crisis in Ukraine. So for many of you, you already know maybe what is happening, but on February 24th of this year, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Via news, social media, and friends and family, we've watched both the devastation of Ukrainian cities and the power of the human spirit as thousands of Ukrainians line up to protect their country and their families, and neighboring countries welcome refugees across their borders. The causes of this conflict go back decades as the world realigned itself following World War II. By invading Ukraine, Russia is looking to limit the expansion of NATO and regain its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. This, in part, is because countries like Ukraine, once Soviet satellite states, are trying to connect to the West by joining NATO and partnering with the EU. As with all wars, the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding is heartbreaking and highlights the true cost of war. Today, we are focusing our attention on how we can help those displaced by this war. The UN estimates that as of the middle of last week, over 3 million Ukrainians have fled their country, and there are thousands more internally displaced. Ukrainians and non-Ukrainian citizens are trying to leave the country, are exiting through border countries like Poland, and citizens who live in besieged cities like Mariupol, the port city that's surrounded by Russian troops, are fleeing to other Ukrainian cities and towns in the West. As a community, we must also recognize the cost of this war on a human level. Within the SEM community, we have students of Russian and Ukrainian descent, as well as those from neighboring countries. And we must honor the physical and emotional toll a war like this plays on our families and their communities. Next, you will hear from Gia and Isis and Isabella, who have direct connections to Ukrainians in living in the middle of this nightmare. And you will hear from Haley, who will speak about some different ways that we as a community plan to help Ukrainian refugees.
My name is Isis. And my name is Gia. And we are both volunteers for a nonprofit organization called Engine. Engine connects Ukrainian students with American students so they can better learn English. And we're just here to talk about the secondhand experience, knowing people from the Ukraine.
I will be talking about my friend Anastasia, a girl from Western Ukraine. I'd only known her a few weeks prior, but I was still concerned about her whereabouts. On the 24th of February, she reached out to me telling me she was in a difficult situation. Since both her parents were both border guards, they weren't allowed to go back home with Anastasia. Later on that day, she left to go to stay at a friend's house. Less than 2 days passed, and she fled to go near a village near the border of Ukraine and Poland. At the border, many foreigners were helping out by cooking for Ukrainian families or helping them get across the border. About a week later, she decided to go to another village where she had family and was going to stay with them. Just recently, she told me when the International Peacekeeping Center was attacked, she was close to the attacks. But she still somehow managed to push through and even help people at the border while all of the attacks were happening.
My student has a bit of a different story. I had known Stacy for about 6 months prior to the invasion. She was living with her family in Kyiv when the first bombs dropped. I recall I was unable to contact her until about 2 days later. It turned out that bombs had been dropped just a few blocks from her house. There have been multiple attempts to transfer her and her family to America, but the situation was and remains too dangerous. Despite the time difference, we've managed to keep in touch by text, and through her, I've learned a little bit about the situation for those who can't leave Ukraine. The sounds of sirens keep her awake all night, and our online classes keep her busy during the day. Yet somehow, Stacy and her family have managed to help distribute blankets and food to neighboring towns and bomb shelters. I think it's inspiring to see someone like Stacy, who's in need, still giving up a part of her life to help others. And I hope that everyone can come together in a similar way and help people in a time like this.
Following is a story of my relative who was in Ukraine when the war started. He is currently safe in Vienna with his daughter and wife. His story starts and he says, I arrived in Ukraine on February 24th to celebrate my 3-year-old, now 4-year-old's daughter's birthday. I knew the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was very tense, but I didn't expect anything to happen. Considering a few hours before I would fly out, everything looked nonetheless peaceful. I arrived in Kiev at 2 a.m., went home, ate, went to bed, and just a few hours passed, my wife woke me up, terrified, saying war is declared. The fear that I felt then was not equal to what was waiting for me. We were under attack for 6 days. For the first 2 days, we were in the house watching from our windows how they were destroying our houses, how they took over Hostomel, how the night sky was turning red every minute, how planes were flying, the noises of siren. I was watching all that from our window. Then I had to move to the basement as staying in the flat was getting too dangerous. Meanwhile, the noises were getting louder, the shaking of the house was getting harder, and my daughter's curiosity was speaking. In order to distract her, I was putting the cartoons as loud as I could. In the next 48 hours, my reality was Sound of Bombs and Song from Masha and the Bear. That's a famous cartoon in Eastern Europe. Afterwards, they started bombing my neighborhood. We had to get out of there, so we did. We went to Subway to save ourselves. I don't remember much that except that it was cold and terrifying. Though that my country would diminish was killing me, and not knowing what would happen to my child, the chance of me not seeing her growing up was petrifying. So I started looking for all the solutions to get my daughter out of there. And for a will of God, I found the 3 tickets to Poland, and we didn't wait. Same hour, we packed up and went out from Subway to our journey to the train station. While we were walking, the married couple saw us and took us in, and we all drove to a train station. We waited for 34 hours for the train. While waiting, the Russian army started bombing near the area of the station. A place was shaking, parts were covering in ruins. There were thousands of people waiting for the miracle, in the cold and in the rain. But after 34 hours, train appeared, and next 8 hours I spent standing with my daughter in my hands, traveling to Hungary. In Hungary, we were moved to special facilities where we would spend the night, eat food. It was a cold night, but it was the first time in 8 days I got some sleep. I couldn't believe we were saved, and all thanks to God. That morning, they have journeyed to Vienna, where they will be staying with their relatives, but Dmitry will be going back to Ukraine to fight next to his people. As he says, and I quote, "I'm praying every night for my country. God knows we will not fall, and I will go back to fight next to my people, as that's where I belong. Dai Slava Ukraine." Here's the video that he took it from his phone. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Haley and I am part of Community Service Club. So there's going to be a dress down day tomorrow in support of Ukraine, and all of the funds are going to go to the United Nations Refugee Agency. So I'll be selling dress down like wristbands today in Fleck during lunch, and I will also be selling them tomorrow at the top of Sprague, like before school starts. So you can buy one either today or tomorrow, but the dress down day is tomorrow. And there's going to be a bake sale on Thursday. We're partnering with Baking Club, also in support of Ukraine. And there's also going to be a coffee and donut sale soon, but we don't know like what day that's going to be on just yet. So, thank you.
So as you heard, obviously there's a personal component to this as well as just a human component to all of this. And so with that, there are also a few opportunities for those who are interested in talking more about this, either about your own experience or just processing it, as well as learning more, because we barely scratched the surface today. So the first is at lunch today. If you'd like to work with or meet, with Safe Spirit, they will be hosting a conversation during the lunch bell. You can just bring your lunch out and sit at the patio tables behind Fleck Hall near back campus. And also, it's not on here, but the Debate Club is hosting a conversation today about a no-fly zone in the region, and that will be at 3 p.m. today in Sprague 308. And then tomorrow night, Mr. Riss has graciously offered our community, both here on campus as well as it being available via Zoom, to give a much more in-depth look at the history of this conflict, where things stand today, and some possible outcomes. He is incredibly knowledgeable about this, and I encourage all of you, particularly if you don't really understand why this war has broken out and what the meaning of this war is, I really encourage you to join him then. And finally, just a request on behalf of our entire community as we partner with the lower school to please participate in one or all of these fundraising efforts. That is the least we can do at this point. Money is the best way that we can help refugee agencies support people, as it's incredibly difficult to get supplies to Ukraine and to these border states. And as you can see on the bottom right, also we have a direct connection specifically to the Ukrainian wrestling team, as our girls program is looking to fundraise to help those athletes make their way to Estonia next week. Thank you very much for your attention and your respect to our students who participated, and for your support in these efforts. Oh, and I get the privilege of saying we're done. You are off to class. Thank you.